Hello and welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiborg. I'm your host.
And I'm your expert. It's great to be here.
Today we are tackling a subject that honestly feels like it's pulled from a cyberpunk novel, but it's actually happening in embassies and situation rooms right now.
Oh, absolutely. It's not science fiction anymore.
Before we really get into it, I just want to encourage you to follow and subscribe wherever you're listening. It really helps.
And you can also subscribe to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast. There's a small monthly fee, but it helps us keep the lights on and gives you access to extra episodes.
Yep, the link for that is right there in the description.
So, today's topic, it's huge. We're looking at how artificial intelligence isn't just another tech trend. It's fundamentally shifting geopolitical power.
Exactly. I think when most of us hear AI, we think of, chatbots writing poems or those funny images of the Pope in a puffer jacket.
Right.
But the material we've got today, it paints a much, much more serious picture. We're seeing this transition from what used to be called information power.
To something new, algorithmic power.
Okay, that's the key distinction, isn't it?
It really is. In, let's say, traditional international relations, power was about who had the information, who knew where the troops were, who had the economic data.
Sure.
But algorithmic power is different. It's not just about having the data anymore. It's about controlling the logic, the algorithm that
Right.
processes all that data.
So it's like the difference between owning a giant library and owning the librarian who decides which books you're even allowed to see.
It's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And that brings us to this really fascinating concept from our sources called algorithmic diplomacy.
Which sounds incredibly cool, but also maybe a little bit ominous.
It could be both. The core idea is that the act of feeding the algorithm, giving it data, is now a deliberate act of geopolitical communication. States are realizing this.
So if they can influence the data and the models.
They can influence how the entire world is interpreted by these systems.
So that's our mission for this session. We're going to unpack that. We'll look at the big players, the US, China, the EU, and how they're trying to regulate this beast to their advantage.
And we'll also look at the tools diplomats are actually using right now, and then get into the really heavy stuff.
AI, colonialism, and the fight for digital sovereignty. It's a lot to cover.
The sources are incredible, though. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. First up, the Great Divergence. This RAND analysis, bridging the artificial intelligence governance gap. It frames this whole thing as a huge philosophical split between the US and China. Is this just another arms race? Who's got the fastest computer?
Oh, that's the surface level. And look, speed definitely matters.
Right.
But what the RAND analysis suggests is that it goes so much deeper. We're talking about fundamentally different philosophies of governance.
Yep.
If you look at the U.S. approach, it's very market-driven. It's the Silicon Valley effect.
The whole move fast and break things idea.
To an extent, yeah. But from a regulatory standpoint, the U.S. is focused on two things: the models and the hardware.
The hardware being the computer chips.
Exactly. The Executive Order 14110 is all about compute thresholds.
Okay, hold on. Compute thresholds. Break that down for us. What are they actually measuring?
Think of it like a speed limit for processing power. The U.S. government is basically saying, if your computer system is powerful enough to perform X quadrillion operations per second, we need to know about it.
So they're regulating the capacity to build the AI brain.
That's it. They
Yeah.
assume if you're building a massive engine, you're building a race car, and they want to register that car.
And this is where those export controls on chips come in, which we keep hearing about.
Because that's the geopolitical lever. By restricting China's access to the most advanced chips, they're trying to physically slow them down. It's a hardware choke point,
Cut off the fuel, the engine stops.
pretty much. And diplomatically, the U.S. prefers these exclusive clubs, the G7 partnerships with allies. They're not too keen on broad, messy UN frameworks for this.
So the U.S. strategy is control the hardware, control the power, and do it with your friends. How does China's approach compare? The sources say their focus is on social stability.
Yes, and it's a world apart. China's approach is state-led, and it's all about the content, the outputs.
So while the U.S. is worried about how powerful the chip is, China's worried about what the AI is actually saying.
Precisely. They want the AI to stay on script. Their regulations explicitly say AI has to reflect socialist core values.
Yeah.
It can't subvert state power.
Wow.
For them, it's about harmony control. If an AI generates text that questions the government, that's a regulatory failure.
That is a massive difference. One side is measuring math, the other is measuring meaning?
And here's the interesting part. Internationally, China pushes for AI governance through the United Nations.
That seems counterintuitive. If they want tight control, why go to the UN? It's huge and famously slow.
It's a very clever strategic play. In the
Yeah.
UN, China has huge sway with the global south.
Yeah.
So they frame it as democratizing AI.
Oh.
They argue that the U.S. wants to keep AI for the rich countries, while China wants to bring it to the General Assembly, where everyone gets a vote.
That is very smart branding. It positions them as the champion of the developing world.
Exactly, against the quote-unquote elitist West.
So, to boil it down, the U.S. is trying to control the chips, the hardware, and China is trying to control the narrative, the content.
That's a great summary.
Which brings us to Europe. For listeners who are interested in this from a European or maybe a Danish perspective, where does the EU fit in here? Are they just watching these two giants fight?
No, Europe is trying to carve out what you could call a third way. There's an analysis from Brookings that talks about the Brussels effect.
I love that term. It sounds like bureaucracy as a superpower.
It kind of is. The Brussels effect is this idea that the EU's single market is so huge and so valuable
Right.
that if the EU sets a strict standard, global companies will just adopt it everywhere. It's easier than making two different products.
So they're not trying to build the biggest AI. They're trying to write the rule book for everyone else's AI.
Exactly. The EU AI Act is the first big attempt to regulate this stuff across the board, and they use what's called a risk-based approach.
Okay, what does that mean, risk-based?
They categorize AI not by its power, but by its potential for harm. You have unacceptable risk.
Like what?
Things like government-run social scoring systems. Tracking citizen behavior.
The Black Mirror episode.
Exactly like that. Those are just banned outright in the EU. Then you have high-risk AI in healthcare, policing, border control. You can use it, but you have to pass all these strict transparency and accuracy tests.
And then there's lower risk stuff like spam filters or video games.
Which gets a much lighter touch.
Yeah.
So the strategy is you want to sell your AI product to our massive market. You have to play by our human-centric rules.
And in doing that, they effectively export European values. If a company has to change its algorithm for Brussels, that change probably rolls out in Copenhagen and Tokyo and New York, too.
That's the goal.
But isn't there a risk here? I mean, if you regulate this heavily, don't you stifle your own innovation? I can imagine there's a big debate about that inside the EU.
Oh, that's the huge internal debate. The sources talk about this tension between the Parliament's LIBE committee, which is all about civil rights, and the IMCO committee, which is focused on business and the market.
So a real fear that while Europe is busy writing the perfect ethical rulebook,
The U.S. and China are busy building the future.
you can't regulate something that you haven't even built yet.
That's the classic European dilemma, safe and slow or fast and risky.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the high-level policy, which is fascinating, but what about the people on the ground, the actual diplomats? Is AI really being used in embassies today, or is it still mostly hype?
This is where it gets really practical. There's a great source, Diplomacy by Dr. Sinisa Grigic, that shows this shift from what he calls diplometrics to AI diplomacy.
And it mentions something called the bilateral navigator. That sounds like a gadget from a spy movie.
It's a very real tool. It's an initiative that produced over 18,500 detailed analyses of bilateral relationships between all the UN member states.
18,000. A human analyst couldn't even... That would take a lifetime.
Exactly. And that's the power. It's about scale.
Yeah.
It helps diplomats understand these complex relationships through data, and it can identify what it calls hidden coalitions.
Hidden coalitions. What do you mean by that?
Well, a human diplomat knows their obvious allies, right? France knows it generally aligns with Germany.
Sure.
But an AI can scan decades of voting records and spot subtle patterns. Like, why do country A and country B, who have nothing else in common, always vote the same way on maritime law? It reveals these leverage points, these alliances that were totally invisible before.
That's incredible. It's like Moneyball for the UN. You're finding value in statistics nobody else is looking at.
In a way, yeah. But it goes beyond just analysis. We're seeing generative AI being used in the actual craft of diplomacy.
Writing speeches and memos for them.
That's the simple stuff. Think bigger. Sentiment analysis. Using AI to monitor, in real time, the public mood in a foreign country.
So instead of just reading the morning paper,
You're analyzing millions of social media posts to get an instant, precise read on public opinion, or a crisis simulation. running scenarios to predict how a conflict might escalate if you make a certain move.
And what about this negotiator by ChatGPT concept?
Yeah, the idea there is you simulate your counterpart. Before walking into a high-stakes negotiation, you can literally argue with an AI that's been trained to think, react, and even get offended like the specific person you're about to meet.
So you get to spar with the bot before the real fight.
You test your arguments, you find the weak points, you refine your strategy. You can ask, okay, if I threaten sanctions, how does the AI representing this foreign minister react?
That sounds incredibly useful, but I don't know, doesn't it risk making diplomacy too robotic? If everyone is just gaming out the optimal move, do we lose that human element?
That is the big danger. And the sources are very clear on this point. This isn't about replacing humans. The goal is what they call augmented diplomacy.
Augmented.
Yeah, you combine the raw processing power of the AI with uniquely human skills like empathy, judgment, cultural nuance.
The diplomat as a cyborg, kind of?
The digitally enhanced statesman, maybe?
Mm.
But this brings us to the darker side of all this, because if data is the new oil, who's getting exploited for it?
This is the AI colonialism concept from that ArcSIFF paper. This one really stuck with me.
It's a critical lens,
Right.
especially if you're looking at global inequality. The dynamic is, it's pretty stark. You got the global north, the U.S., Western Europe. They have the data centers, the infrastructure, the capital.
And then you have the global south, developing nations who provide the raw data.
And often the cheap human labor for things like data labeling.
The people clicking, this is a stop sign 1,000 times so a self-driving car in California can work.
Exactly that. It's a form of extraction. The global south is feeding the algorithm, but they don't own the models that result from it. They're the resource providers, not the architects.
Which has led to this push for data sovereignty.
Countries are waking up. They're realizing that having all their citizens' data stored on servers in, say, Virginia or Dublin is a massive strategic vulnerability,
So they're passing these data localization laws,
demanding that data generated inside their borders has to stay inside their borders.
which is creating what the sources call a splinter net, right? A fragmented digital world.
Correct. And it makes global cooperation so much harder. The UN tried to tackle this with the Global Digital Compact, the GDC, back in September 2024.
What was the goal with that?
It's this comprehensive deal to try and close that digital divide, to make sure AI benefits everyone, not just Silicon Valley and Beijing.
Did it work? Is it binding?
That's where it gets complicated. The South Center source we read points out it's non-binding. It's a set of aspirations. And you see that same tension we talked about before.
The global south versus the U.S.
Right. The Global South sees the UN as the only place they can get a fair shake. The U.S. is deeply skeptical of UN-led tech governance, fearing it will slow innovation and give authoritarian regimes too much say.
So we've got this fractured map. The U.S. is building fences around hardware. China's building walls around content. Europe is building a fortress of rules.
And the Global South is trying to build a fence around their own data to keep it from being taken.
That's a perfect summary, and it leads to maybe the most subtle part of all this. Narrative seeding.
This is from the journal source, and it's mind-bending. It's not just propaganda anymore.
It's deeper than that.
So much deeper. Traditional propaganda tries to convince you, the person. Narrative seeding is about shaping the training data of the large language models themselves.
Wait, so you're not trying to convince the user, you're trying to convince the AI so that the AI will then convince the user.
Exactly. You were trying to define the reality that the AI perceives and then regurgitates. If an AI is trained mostly on US-centered text, guess what? It's going to produce US-centric worldviews.
A bias towards liberal democracy, capitalism, Western history.
And if you're sitting in Moscow or Tehran, that looks like a cultural weapon pointed right at you.
Which is why we're seeing this push for informational autarky from places like Russia.
Autarky, self-sufficiency. They are trying to insulate their digital space. They want to build sovereign AI that doesn't rely on Western data, Western narratives.
They don't want their citizens using a chatbot that thinks Crimea is part of Ukraine.
They want a chatbot that reflects their official truth. We're seeing it in the Gulf states, too, with the Falcon model in the UAE.
They're building high-quality Arabic language models.
Yes, and it's not just about translation. It's about projecting cultural influence, about modernizing on their own terms without having Silicon Valley define their digital culture for them.
It's like a new kind of space race. But instead of racing to the moon, everyone is racing to define reality itself.
That's what algorithmic diplomacy is. The diplomat of the past negotiated borders on a physical map. The diplomat of the future might negotiate the weights and biases in a neural network.
That is a heavy thought. So, bringing it all home, what does this mean for you, our listener, maybe sitting in Copenhagen or anywhere else watching this unfold?
I think it means we have to get used to the idea of digital borders. We're used to showing a passport to cross a line on a map. Now our data has to show a passport.
And for anyone working in this field, diplomats, analysts, it sounds like the job description is changing overnight.
It absolutely is. The diplomat of the future needs AI literacy as much as they need to speak foreign languages. You can't negotiate a trade deal if you don't understand how the algorithms monitoring that deal actually work.
And if you don't understand it, you're going to be manipulated by the person who does.
Precisely. Which leads to one final thought. The biggest dilemma in all of this, for me, is the question of meaningful human control.
The human in the loop.
Yes, as we hand over more analysis, more drafting, more simulation to these AI systems, we have to make sure that moral and legal responsibility stays with a human. These algorithms are often black boxes. We don't always know how they reached a conclusion.
So if a diplomatic bot makes a recommendation that escalates a crisis, who's responsible? The coder, the diplomat who used it, the country.
That is the trillion-dollar question. We can't let ourselves get to a place where we can just say, the algorithm made me do it.
We can't.
But the temptation to rely on these incredibly powerful tools will be immense.
Well, on that slightly terrifying but also exhilarating note, I think that's where we have to leave it for today.
It is a brave new world.
It certainly is. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to understand more about these huge shifts in global power, please make sure to follow the podcast on whatever platform you're using.
And hey, if you have a moment, rate the show 5 stars. It really does help us reach more people.
Thanks for listening to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg.
We'll see you next time.